a simple dress, a quiet dinner, and one cruel assumption that would change everything. When Lily Parker, a billionaire who prefers to stay out of the spotlight, walks into an upscale restaurant in New York, no one expects her to be anything other than a nobody. But when the arrogant manager, Alan Matthews, humiliates her in front of the entire restaurant, he has no idea that his judgment will cost him everything. What follows is a story of pride, regret, and a powerful lesson in humility that no one saw coming by the time Alan realizes who Lily truly is. The consequences of his actions are irreversible and the tables have turned in ways he never could have imagined. Lily Parker walked into the grand lobby of Café La Rue, an exclusive restaurant perched on the upper floors of a posh Manhattan building. The place was known for its luxurious setting, Michelin-starred dishes, and an atmosphere of sophistication that oozed from every chandelier, velvet drape, and polished table. It was a favorite of the city's elite, the type of place where people came to be seen, not simply to eat. And yet, Lily wasn't interested in any of it. She just wanted a quiet, peaceful evening, away from the suffocating noise of her billionaire lifestyle. A woman who was worth billions, yet lived her life with an understated, almost invisible presence. Lily didn't mind the low-key nature of her appearance. She had never cared for the kind of wealth that shouted from the rooftops. She preferred simplicity. Tonight, she had donned a simple navy blue dress, nothing expensive, just something comfortable. The hemline of the dress came just below her knees, and it flowed gently with each step she took. Her shoes were flats, practical, with little adornment. No sparkling diamonds or designer bags hung from her arm. There was nothing flashy about her yet. Everything about her seemed timelessly elegant. Her blonde hair was loosely pinned up, and her makeup was light, barely noticeable, highlighting the natural beauty she had always possessed. The moment she entered, the quiet hum of conversation and clinking silverware seemed to shift. Her arrival was met with subtle glances, the kind that people give when they see someone who doesn't fit the mold. It wasn't just Lily's dress that drew attention. It was her aura. In a room full of extravagant outfits and loud personalities, Lily was an anomaly, and in her experience, people didn't always like anomalies. She approached the hostess stand, the gold-plated menus stacked neatly on the counter. The hostess, a young woman with an air of indifference, briefly glanced up from her tablet, her eyes flicking over Lily. There was no greeting, just a quick, almost dismissive look. Lily had grown used to IT people, often assumed she didn't belong. The momentary glance was enough to let her know that the hostess had already judged her. "Table, for one?" the hostess asked, with a forced smile. Lily nodded politely. "Yes, please." The hostess led her through the restaurant, passing tables of well-dressed patrons. Their voices lowered in hushed tones as they spoke in the refined language of the city's elite. The lighting was soft, the chandeliers overhead casting golden hues across the room. It was all too perfect, too pristine. But Lily wasn't impressed by perfection. To her, the fancier a place, the more it revealed the insecurity of its guests. People came here not just to eat, but to show off. To be seen. As Lily walked past a corner table, she caught the gaze of a group of men seated there. They paused, mid-conversation, their eyes following her. She was used to the looks, the judgmental stares from those who thought they knew her, based solely on her appearance. She wasn't wearing a designer dress, nor did she have a flashy handbag or a man on her arm. Lily didn't want to stand out. She never did. But to them, her simplicity was a mark of inferiority. A couple of them whispered to each other, their words muffled by the din of the restaurant. Lily ignored it. She wasn't here for their approval. She wasn't here to be seen. Finally, the hostess led her to a table in the far corner of the room, away from the spotlight. Lily smiled softly, appreciative of the quiet privacy. She placed her purse gently on the chair beside her, unzipping it and pulling out her phone. It wasn't unusual for her to come out alone. She valued solitude, a rare commodity when your family's wealth could have the entire world's attention at any moment. She wasn't a socialite, and she didn't like attention. She wanted only one thing from tonight: peace. As she opened the menu, her eyes scanned the words printed on its elegant pages. The prices didn't faze her, nor did the names of dishes that only those who had eaten in every corner of the world might recognize. She wasn't here to be impressed by the food. She was here to relax, to unwind, to escape from the world that had been chasing her for years. But her brief moment of peace was interrupted. Alan Matthews, the restaurant's manager, watched her from across the room. Alan was a tall, well-built man, his sharp suit pressed perfectly, his perfectly combed hair and cold demeanor made him appear distant, as if he was constantly looking down on everyone who wasn't in his social circle. His eyes flicked over Lily as she sat down at her table, and for a moment, something in him shifted. He scrutinized her appearance, scanning her dress, her shoes, the simplicity of her look. He didn't think she belonged here, not in a restaurant like this. To him, the women who dined at Café La Rue were usually dressed in the latest fashion, dripping with jewels and makeup. They were the socialites, the influencers, the ones who wore their wealth like a badge of honor. But Lily didn't fit that mold. She was too modest, too simple. She couldn't possibly be a part of the exclusive group of people he catered to, could she? Alan walked across the room, his steps confident and purposeful. His expression remained neutral, but there was a sense of superiority in his movements. As he approached her table, Lily looked up briefly from her menu, catching the glint of his eyes as he stood over her. "Excuse me," Miss Allen began, his voice smooth but sharp, as if delivering an unwelcome announcement. "I couldn't help but notice that you're dining alone tonight. Are you sure you're in the right place? Our clientele usually requires reservations, and it's uncommon for someone dressed so simply to be here." Lily looked up from her menu, her brow furrowing. She had been in situations like this before when people judged her based solely on her appearance. But what bothered her most wasn't the comment itself. It was the arrogance behind it. The way he spoke as though her presence was somehow beneath him. She wasn't used to that, especially not from someone in the service industry. "I'm sure I'm in the right place," she replied calmly, setting the menu aside. She raised her eyes to meet his. "And I'm quite comfortable in my dress, thank you." Alan raised an eyebrow. He wasn't expecting her to respond with such poise. He had assumed she would be embarrassed or self-conscious, maybe even apologetic. But Lily stood her ground. The quiet confidence in her voice an unsettling contrast to her appearance. "You see," Alan continued, his smile turning slightly condescending, "this is a place where the city's elite come to dine. Most of them dress accordingly. I'm afraid you may feel out of place." His voice lingered on the words, as if savoring his little jab. Lily paused, a flicker of irritation flashing across her face. But she quickly masked it, refusing to let his words affect her. "I'm perfectly fine here," she said softly. "I came for a meal, not for attention." Alan smirked, thinking she was merely trying to save face. He turned to leave, but paused, casting one last glance at her. The words he had spoken, however, would not be easily forgotten. Not by Lily, and certainly not by Alan. The restaurant was alive with its usual hum of conversation's distant chatter, the soft clinking of cutlery, and the occasional burst of laughter from a group of well-dressed patrons. But none of it reached Lily as she sat at her corner table, the silence around her thickening with each moment. Despite the indulgent atmosphere, she was focused on the calmness of her thoughts, trying to escape the noisy chaos of the life she led outside of these walls. Lily's phone buzzed on the table, but she didn't reach for it immediately. The simple distractions were always welcome, but tonight, she was determined to embrace a quiet dinner. But as she tried to settle in, the restaurant manager, Alan Matthews, stood in her line of sight, staring down at her with an air of arrogance. His posture was straight, and his eyes gleamed with the certainty of someone who felt superior. He was about to offer her what he perceived as a piece of advice. "Excuse me," Miss Allen said with a slightly raised voice. His words were as smooth as polished stone, but they carried the sharpness of judgment. Lily looked up, momentarily startled by his approach. Alan's presence felt overwhelming, and she could tell by the tone of his voice that he had already made up his mind about who she was. "Is everything to your liking?" he asked, though it didn't sound like a genuine inquiry. He stood by her table, his hands clasped together as though he were addressing an employee instead of a guest. Lily smiled politely, unsure of what to say. She wasn't here to make waves, but it seemed as if Alan was already set on creating a storm. She chose not to answer immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly in contemplation. "I've ordered just fine," she said, keeping her voice level, but her tone wasn't quite as warm as it had been moments before. She had no interest in small talk with a manager who had already made his mind up about her. Still, she wanted to remain composed. "Thank you." Alan's expression was unreadable, for a moment, before a knowing smile spread across his face. His gaze flicked down to her dress, then back up to her face. He didn't say it outright, but Lily could sense his silent judgment, the quiet derision that lingered in the air like a thick fog. "You know," he began with a smirk, his voice lowered to ensure only she could hear, "we often have people with more appropriate attire. It's important to blend in, you know. In a place like this, people dress with the kind of care that signals they belong. Lily's breath caught in her throat. The words were more than just an innocent observation. They were a pointed critique, a judgment about her choice of dress. A moment of vulnerability crept up on her, but she pushed it down. She knew she was in the right here. It wasn't the first time she had been mocked for her appearance, and she was sure it wouldn't be the last. Still, Alan's words stung. "See," she said, her voice quiet but firm, as though she were holding back a tide of emotion. "I didn't realize there was a uniform for belonging." Alan chuckled, unaware of how his casual remarks were affecting Lily. "You'd be surprised," he said. He took another step closer to her table, his smile widening, as if he were offering her some sort of truth she had failed to grasp. "The people who dine here, they know what's expected of them. It's about more than just money, about attitude, status, a certain kind of grace. And I've got to say, you seem a little out of place here." He eyed her outfit again, his gaze lingering for just a second longer than was necessary. Lily's face reddened slightly, but she refused to let him see the effect his words had on her. "I don't see why my dress should matter," she replied, lifting her chin in defiance. "I'm here for dinner, not for the approval of others. I'm sure your guests appreciate their luxuries, but I'm not concerned about that. I came to eat." Alan's eyes flickered with an emotion Lily couldn't quite place. Was it amusement? Disdain? Whatever it was, it made him feel a sense of superiority. He had put her in her place, at least in his mind, and that was all that mattered. He took a step back, and with a self-satisfied smirk, he nodded. "I'll leave you to it then," he said, before turning on his heel to walk away. But just before he could retreat, he paused, his back still facing her. "But don't be surprised if people start staring. I can't imagine they're used to seeing someone like you in a place like this." Lily's breath quickened for a moment, but she held herself together. The pressure to respond, to say something cutting, was there. She could have unleashed a sharp retort, reminded him of her connections, or told him that she could buy and sell the entire restaurant without a second thought, but she didn't. That wasn't who she was. That wasn't why she came here. Alan walked away, disappearing into the crowd of patrons and staff. But Lily couldn't shake the words he had spoken. She stared at the menu for a while, the fine print swimming before her eyes, her mind replaying his taunts. She didn't belong here, he had said, but deep down, Lily knew something Alan didn't. The place where she belonged had nothing to do with the clothes on her back or the judgment of a man who had nothing more to offer than condescension. It wasn't about status. It was about who you were inside, and she knew that better than anyone. Minutes passed, and Lily took a deep breath, trying to push aside the sting of Alan's remarks. She wasn't going to let him ruin her evening. She'd been through too much to let a man like him get to her, but the deeper she sat and thought, the more she realized that it wasn't just his words that bothered her. It was the realization of how easily people like him were able to tear down someone who was different, someone who didn't fit into their narrow expectations of what wealth and worth should look like. As she looked up again, she noticed Alan glancing over at her, his posture stiff as he watched her from across the room. There was something in his eyes, something that told her he was curious about who she really was and why she was there. He would soon learn the truth, but by then, it would be too late. The dinner hour was slowly fading into the quiet hush of the restaurant's afterglow. As the night stretched on, Lily tried her best to ignore the discomfort in the air. Alan's words still lingered, but she refused to let them control her. She was used to this people who thought they could size her up based on appearance, who thought they could determine her worth by her clothing or demeanor. It didn't matter. Her worth was defined by more than any superficial judgment. She sipped her wine, leaning back in her seat, savoring the moment of quiet solitude that had eluded her for so long. The restaurant's elegant surroundings had begun to feel like nothing more than a stagia, place where people put on performances of status and importance. But Lily didn't need to play that game. She was far beyond needing validation from the people around her. As she checked the time on her phone, a sudden realization struck her. She hadn't felt truly relaxed in ages. The constant chatter of expectations from her family, her business associates, her peers, it was overwhelming. She longed for peace, the kind of peace that only came when she could disconnect from the pressures of wealth and just be herself. Tonight, she had hoped to find that peace, but now it seemed distant, clouded by Alan's sharp comments. Just as she was sinking deeper into her thoughts, her phone buzzed again. This time, It wasn't a reminder of meetings or messages from her assistants. It was a simple notification, an alert from her personal account manager. Lily's brow furrowed as she unlocked her phone and read the message: transaction completed. Caf. La Rue. Purchase successful. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't surprised. She had been contemplating buying the restaurant for months. But to make the purchase right now, it felt so sudden. Yet, in a way, it felt right. She looked around the restaurant, taking in the opulence around her. This was the kind of place where people placed far too much importance on their appearance, where the superficial ruled, but it could be different. With her influence, she could make it something that truly mattered. A place where anyone could dine without judgment. Lily made a quick phone call to her financial advisor to finalize the details, her fingers flying over the keys as she handled the transaction. The world of high finance was something she knew well, but it wasn't about the money to her, it was about power. The power to create change. The power to reshape this world that had cast its judgments on her and so many others. She glanced over at the staff, noticing Alan, still unaware of what had just transpired. There he was, still parading his cold, dismissive attitude toward the guests, still convinced that he ruled over them. Little did he know, his kingdom was about to crumble. When the phone call ended, Lily stood up from her table, her back straight, and her movements confident. Her mind was made up. She wasn't going to let Alan's attitude dictate her evening, or her experience here any longer. It was time to take control. As Lily made her way toward the manager's office, she noticed Alan walking toward her, his expression hardening when he saw her standing in the hallway. His gaze flickered, confused by her sudden change in demeanor. But he quickly masked his surprise with a professional smile. "Is everything to your liking?" Mr. Allen asked again, his words now laced with an underlying arrogance, as if he were attempting to redeem himself for his earlier behavior. Lily paused for a moment. Considering how best to handle the situation, she could already tell that Alan had no idea who she really was. She hadn't dropped any hints about her wealth, her name, or the vast empire she controlled. To him, she was still just the poor girl who didn't belong here. She gave him a calm, cool smile. "Actually, Alan, I'd like to talk about the future of this place. I'm going to make some changes." Alan raised an eyebrow, visibly puzzled by her response. Changes? He was about to make a remark, but Lily continued speaking before he could finish. "I've just purchased this restaurant," Lily said, her voice steady but resolute. "It's mine now." There was a long, frozen pause between them. For a moment, Alan said nothing, his mind struggling to process her words. The shock in his eyes was enough to send a jolt through his entire body. His mouth opened, then closed, as if he were searching for some kind of explanation. "What?" he asked finally, his voice shaky. "You bought the restaurant?" Lily nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "Sis, it wasn't hard. The paperwork's already been filed." Alan blinked again, disbelief registering across his face. It was obvious he hadn't expected this at all. In his mind, Lily was just another young woman who didn't fit the mold of the people who were supposed to dine at places like Caf La Rue. He had assumed she was some tourist or a girl, pretending to be someone she wasn't. And yet, here she was, standing before him as the owner of the very place he had worked so hard to manage. I don't know what to say," Alan stammered, the weight of his mistake beginning to hit him. His previously composed demeanor cracked under the pressure, and he looked like a deer caught in the headlights. "You don't have to say anything," Lily said coolly, "but I do want you to understand this. I won't tolerate people like you judging others based on their appearance. This place, under my ownership, will be a place where anyone can feel welcome no matter their background, their dress, or their status." Alan's face turned a deep shade of red. He could feel the sting of humiliation creeping up on him, and for the first time in his career, he felt utterly powerless. He had judged her, mocked her for wearing a simple dress, and now, it was him who was being judged. Lily didn't wait for him to respond. She turned on her heel and walked toward the front door, leaving Alan standing there, speechless and shattered. The truth was undeniable now. His arrogance had cost him everything. He had made assumptions based on appearances, and those assumptions had led to his downfall. Lily's footsteps echoed through the lobby as she exited the restaurant. She felt a strange sense of satisfaction, not because of the money she had just spent, but because she had made her point. She was more than just her appearance, and Alan Matthews had just learned that the hard way. The following morning, the city of New York was buzzing with its usual energy. But for Alan Matthews, the world had shifted beneath his feet. The weight of the events from the previous night was still heavy on his shoulders. His mind replayed every moment, his dismissive attitude toward Lily, his mockery, the judgment in his voice. He had been so certain, so sure of himself, until she had revealed the truth. Now, as the morning light filtered through his apartment window, Alan couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that clung to him like a second skin. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall. The usual rush of adrenaline that came with the responsibilities of managing such an elite restaurant had long since evaporated. In its place was a deep, suffocating sense of regret. He had spent the night trying to convince himself that it wasn't that big of a deal, that Lily had simply been an outlier, a rare exception to the rule of wealthy diners. But deep down, he knew he had crossed a line. He had made a terrible misjudgment. The phone on his bedside table buzzed, cutting through the silence of his thoughts. It was an email alert. Alan opened it with a sense of dread, as though he already knew what it contained. The subject line read, "Urgent, immediate, action required regarding Cafe Rue." His hands trembled as he clicked open the message. His heart sank as he read the contents. "Dear Alan, we regret to inform you that your position as manager of Cafe Rue has been terminated. As per the new owner's directive, all employees must be reassigned or let go, effective immediately. Your access to all company systems has been revoked. Please return any company property and vacate the premises. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Sincerely." The board of directors. Cafe Rue. Alan stared at the screen, his mind racing. It was over. He had lost everything. Not just the job he had spent years working toward, but his dignity. His reputation, everything he had built, had been undone in a single night. And the worst part, he had no one to blame but himself. Lily Parker's name had been on the lips of everyone in the city that morning. News outlets had picked up the story of the unexpected purchase of Cafe Rue, and it was quickly becoming one of the most talked about topics in New York. The woman he had humiliated was now the owner of the restaurant, and his life was in shambles because of his inability to see past his own arrogance. The sense of regret gnawed at him, a bitter reminder of his foolishness. How had he not seen it coming? How had he not realized that the simple, unassuming woman sitting alone at his restaurant could be someone far more powerful than he ever imagined? His pride had blinded him. It was a mistake that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. Later that afternoon, Alan found himself standing outside the towering building that housed Cafe Rue. It looked the same as it had the night before, elegant, pristine, the epitome of luxury and wealth. But for him, it had become a symbol of his failure. He stood across the street, watching as the staff hurried about inside, preparing for the dinner rush. He could almost feel the weight of Lily's gaze on him, though she wasn't there. It was as if she were watching him from afar, silently judging him for his actions. Alan's mind drifted back to the previous night. The humiliation he had inflicted on Lily had been so casual, so thoughtless. He had assumed that her simple attire meant she didn't belong in a place like Cafe Rue. He had assumed she was just another nobody trying to pretend to be something. She wasn't. But he was wrong, so terribly wrong. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, had lost everything. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and meetings. Alan had been fired from his position, and was now looking for work. But every door seemed to be closed. The reputation of Cafe Rue was already tarnished by his actions, and no one wanted to hire him. Not after the scandal with his confidence. Once a key component of his personality had crumbled. The sharp, polished exterior he had cultivated over the years had been shattered. And in its place was a man who had learned a painful lesson. Judgment without understanding only leads to destruction. Alan found himself replaying the scene in his mind over and over again. He thought about how he had dismissed Lily, how he had mocked her in front of others, and how he had assumed she didn't belong. It had been a moment of arrogance, one that seemed so small at the time but had ultimately changed his entire life. He had been so wrapped up in his own sense of superiority that he hadn't even considered the possibility that he was wrong. And now, he was paying the price. As the week dragged on, Alan tried to move forward. He sent out resumes, networked with old contacts, and tried to rebuild some semblance of his career. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be easy. His actions had left a permanent mark on his reputation, and rebuilding that would take time. He couldn't help but think of Lily and the calm, measured way she had handled the situation. She had been gracious, dignified Devon when he had tried to tear her down. Alan had underestimated her. But in doing so, he had underestimated himself as well. He had let his pride and assumptions dictate his actions, and now he was paying for it. He had learned the hard way that you can never truly know someone by their appearance. You can never judge their worth based on what they wear or how they present themselves to the world. Lily Parker had shown him that. One evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, Alan received another notification on his phone. This time, it was a message from a contact at the restaurant industry's biggest event. It was a simple message, but the words sent a jolt through him. The new owner of Café La Rue is hosting a charity gala next week. They're inviting everyone who has supported the restaurant. Will you be attending? Alan stared at the message for a long moment. He could almost hear Lily's voice in his head, her calm, unwavering words about making change. A charity gala. He could picture it. Now the glitz, the glamour, the people who once looked down on her, now fawning over her generosity. A pang of regret stabbed at him. He had been a part of something beautiful, something meaningful, but he had let his arrogance destroy it. He hadn't just lost his job, he had lost his dignity. And now, he would have to live with the consequences. Later that evening, Alan stood by his window, looking out over the city that never stopped moving. The lights of New York twinkled below, a world of opportunity waiting for anyone brave enough to take it. He had a long road ahead of him, but one thing was clear: he would never forget the lesson Lily had taught him. Never judge someone by their appearance, because you never know who they really are. As the last of the sunlight faded, Alan took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever the future held. He could only hope that, one day, Lily would forgive him for his mistakes. But for now, he was left with a bitter taste of regret, and the knowledge that his actions had changed his life forever.